July 1945. In a small Bavarian town, the war had ended only weeks earlier, but silence still ruled the streets. Roofless buildings stood like broken teeth against the summer sky. Dust drifted through empty windows where classrooms once echoed with children's voices. The chalkboards were still marked with lessons abandoned years before, when boys were sent to uniforms instead of desks, and teachers replaced books with ideology. An American military truck rolled slowly past the rubble. Soldiers stepped down, not carrying rifles at the ready, but wooden crates filled with notebooks, pencils, and folded flags bearing unfamiliar symbols of occupation authority. Behind shattered doorways, German mothers watched carefully, unsure whether to fear or hope. For years, schools had taught loyalty to a regime that no longer existed. Now the doors were being unlocked again, not by German officials, but by former enemies. One by one, children gathered outside the damaged schoolhouse, clutching their mothers' hands. And in that quiet moment, education became one of the first battlefields of peace. By the spring of 1945, the war in Europe was no longer a question of victory, but of survival. The German Reich that had once stretched across the continent was collapsing from every direction. Soviet forces pushed relentlessly from the east, crossing the Oder River and advancing toward Berlin. From the west, American, British, and Canadian armies moved across the Rhine, breaking through defenses that only months earlier had been described by Nazi propaganda as impenetrable. German cities lay shattered beneath years of strategic bombing. Cologne, Hamburg, Dresden, and countless smaller towns had been reduced to fields of rubble. Transportation networks barely functioned. Railways twisted under bomb damage. Bridges collapsed into rivers. Electricity flickered unpredictably, and clean water became uncertain in many regions. But the physical destruction told only part of the story. German society itself had fractured. Millions of men were dead, missing, or captured. By early 1945, entire communities were composed largely of women, children, and the elderly. Mothers stood in food lines that stretched for hours. Children scavenged through ruins, searching for coal or scraps of wood to burn. Schools across Germany had gradually closed during the final years of the war, converted into military hospitals, command posts, or shelters from air raids. Education had already been disrupted long before Germany's surrender. Under Nazi rule, schools had served a political purpose as much as an educational one. Curriculum increasingly emphasized racial ideology, obedience, and preparation for war. Physical training often replaced academic instruction. Older students were organized into auxiliary military roles, including anti-aircraft defense units. By 1944, many classrooms were nearly empty as teenage boys were drafted into desperate defensive formations. When Allied armies crossed into Germany itself, they encountered not only military resistance, but a civilian population exhausted by total war. American soldiers advancing through Western Germany frequently described towns filled with silent observers watching cautiously from windows or cellar entrances. Many civilians feared revenge. Years of propaganda had warned them that Allied forces would destroy German culture and punish civilians indiscriminately. Instead, American military planners arrived with a different challenge: what to do with a defeated nation of nearly 70 million people. Germany formally surrendered on May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day. The Nazi government ceased to exist. Administrative authority collapsed almost overnight. Police forces dissolved, ministries disappeared, and local governments struggled to function. In many areas, there were simply no officials left capable of organizing daily life. The Allies had anticipated this vacuum long before the war ended. Planning documents created as early as 1943 outlined how Germany would be occupied and governed after defeat. The country would be divided into zones controlled by the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. Each occupying power would assume responsibility not only for security, but also for restoring basic civil order. For American commanders, the immediate priorities were clear: prevent starvation, stop disease outbreaks, maintain public safety, and dismantle Nazi influence. Yet another problem quickly became visible. Millions of German children had effectively lost years of education. In towns across Bavaria, Hesse, and Württemberg, American officers found school buildings damaged or abandoned. Textbooks promoted Nazi ideology. Teachers' political affiliations were unclear. Some educators had been committed party members. Others had quietly resisted but remained under suspicion. Without functioning schools, children wandered streets, already strained by food shortages and uncertainty. Military reports began noting a growing concern. Idle youth in a defeated society could become unstable, resentful, or vulnerable to extremist influence once again. Education was no longer merely a social service. It became a strategic necessity. At the same time, American soldiers encountered scenes that complicated their understanding of the enemy they had fought. Mothers struggled to feed families with ration cards nearly worthless in the chaos. Children approached cautiously, curious about foreign uniforms and unfamiliar accents. Many soldiers, themselves barely older than the teenagers they encountered, recognized that the war's end had created not triumph, but responsibility. The battlefield had shifted. Victory now required rebuilding a society that had been shaped for 12 years by dictatorship and war. And as American occupation authorities began to assess Germany's future, one question emerged repeatedly in planning meetings and field reports alike. If a new Germany was to exist, where would it begin? The answer, increasingly, pointed toward the classroom. Long before Germany surrendered, Allied leaders understood that winning the war militarily would not be enough. The deeper challenge lay in preventing another conflict from emerging out of the same political and social foundations that had produced Nazism. At conferences in Yalta in February 1945 and later in Potsdam during the summer, Allied powers agreed that Germany would undergo not only occupation, but transformation. The official goals were summarized in 4 principles: demilitarization, denazification, democratization, and decentralization. Each occupying power interpreted these goals differently, but within the American zone, policymakers quickly concluded that education would become one of the most powerful tools for long-term stability. Responsibility for civilian administration fell to the U.S. military government, formerly known as the Office of Military Government, United States, or OMGS. Unlike combat units, these officers included lawyers, economists, engineers, linguists, and educators. Many had studied European history before the war. Now they were tasked with rebuilding an entire civil society from ruins. When American administrators entered German towns in mid-1945, they discovered an educational system deeply entangled with Nazi ideology. Textbooks glorified racial hierarchy and military sacrifice. Maps depicted expanded German territories that no longer existed. Portraits of Adolf Hitler still hung in classrooms where instruction had ceased months earlier. The first step was closure. Across the American occupation zone, schools were temporarily shut down by military order. This was not punishment, but inspection. Every teacher underwent political screening. Local officials compiled questionnaires, known as Fragebogen, requiring educators to disclose party membership, affiliations, and wartime activities. Some teachers were removed permanently. Others were suspended pending investigation. The process was slow and often controversial, but American planners believed credibility depended on ensuring classrooms no longer served propaganda. At the same time, another crisis grew urgent. Summer turned toward autumn, and millions of children remained without structured education. Reports warned that prolonged disruption could produce what officials described as a lost generation, shaped more by war trauma than by civic values. American authorities therefore shifted from dismantling to rebuilding. Education officers began drafting entirely new curricula. Subjects once dominated by ideology were replaced with mathematics, literature, science, and civic instruction emphasizing democratic responsibility. Lessons avoided political indoctrination but introduced concepts unfamiliar to many German students: pluralism, individual rights, and critical discussion. Practical challenges were immense. School buildings had been damaged or destroyed. Windows were shattered. Heating systems failed. Desks were missing or burned for fuel during harsh winters. Paper supplies were scarce across Europe, forcing early classes to share notebooks or reuse salvaged materials. American logistical units, originally designed to supply advancing armies, now delivered chalk, textbooks, and basic furniture alongside food rations. In many towns, reopening a school required cooperation between former enemies. American engineers inspected structures for safety. German civilians cleared rubble. Local carpenters repaired doors and benches using salvaged wood. The process transformed occupation into collaboration, though trust developed slowly. Mothers played a central role in this transition. With fathers absent or imprisoned, women organized community efforts to prepare buildings and gather children. Military government reports frequently noted that German women were among the strongest supporters of reopening schools, viewing education as a return to normal life after years defined by fear and loss. American soldiers themselves often became unexpected participants. Off-duty troops helped repaint classrooms or distribute supplies. Some units organized informal English lessons or recreational activities for children waiting for schools to reopen officially. These interactions, small in scale but repeated across hundreds of towns, began reshaping perceptions on both sides. Yet education policy also carried strategic intent. U.S. planners believed democratic habits could not simply be imposed through laws. They had to be learned early. Classrooms would teach discussion instead of obedience, questioning instead of unquestioned authority. In this sense, reopening schools was not merely humanitarian, it was political reconstruction conducted quietly through daily routine. By late summer 1945, authorization orders began moving through occupation headquarters. Selected schools, once inspected and cleared, received permission to reopen under supervision of newly vetted teachers. Notices appeared on public boards announcing enrollment dates. For communities surrounded by ruins, these announcements carried unexpected emotional weight. They signaled stability where chaos had ruled. They promised a future measured not by sirens or troop movements, but by lessons and schedules. And when the first school doors prepared to open again under American authority, the moment represented more than administrative success. It marked the beginning of Germany's transformation, witnessed most closely by those who had endured the war at home, waiting to see what peace would look like for their children. Angle 1. The human perspective, German mothers and children. For German mothers, the end of the war brought relief mixed with uncertainty. Many had survived years defined by air raids, rationing, and constant anxiety over missing family members. By 1945, daily life revolved around securing food and shelter rather than planning for the future. Children had grown accustomed to sirens and shelters instead of classrooms. When announcements appeared that schools would reopen, reactions were cautious. Some mothers feared indoctrination would simply take a new form. Others worried about safety in damaged buildings. Yet the desire for normalcy proved stronger than suspicion. Contemporary occupation reports describe mothers arriving early on reopening days, often accompanying younger children to the entrances. Clothing was frequently patched or oversized, reflecting shortages that persisted long after combat ended. Many children carried improvised school supplies, scraps of paper tied together with string, pencils worn nearly to stubs. The emotional significance lay not only in education itself, but in routine. School meant predictable hours, warm rooms during colder months, and supervised environments where children could temporarily escape the instability surrounding them. For women managing households alone, it also represented a brief restoration of structure in lives disrupted by total war. Observers noted expressions that ranged from guarded curiosity to visible relief. The sight of children entering classrooms again suggested something profound. Survival had turned into continuity. Angle 2. The American soldier's perspective. 4 American soldiers assigned to occupation duties, reopening schools presented an unexpected extension of military service. Many had fought through France or crossed the Rhine only months earlier. Combat training had prepared them for resistance, not reconstruction. Letters home frequently describe surprise at civilian conditions inside Germany. Soldiers encountered hunger, damaged infrastructure, and populations far removed from the image of a unified enemy presented during wartime propaganda. Interaction with children became one of the first points of informal contact between occupiers and civilians. Military units occasionally assisted education officers by transporting supplies or helping prepare buildings. Engineers repaired roofs or cleared debris blocking entrances. Infantrymen accustomed to patrols found themselves unloading desks or distributing notebooks. These activities altered psychological boundaries formed during combat. The enemy became civilians struggling with defeat rather than opposing soldiers. Some American servicemen later recalled that helping reopen schools made the purpose of victory feel tangible. Instead of destruction, they witnessed construction. At the same time, discipline remained strict. Soldiers operated under regulations designed to prevent fraternization or favoritism. The occupation required balance, compassion without losing authority. Schools therefore became controlled spaces where interaction occurred within defined limits, reinforcing order while allowing gradual trust. Angle 3. Psychological reconstruction. Beyond humanitarian concerns, reopening schools carried deep psychological implications for both nations. Germany in 1945 faced what historians later described as a moral and institutional vacuum. The collapse of Nazi authority left millions questioning previously accepted beliefs. Children, in particular, had spent formative years immersed in state ideology. Many had joined youth organizations that blended education with political loyalty. American planners believed early intervention mattered. Psychologists advising military government warned that prolonged uncertainty could reinforce resentment or nostalgia for authoritarian stability. Structured education offered an alternative, a daily environment emphasizing cooperation, discussion, and factual learning rather than mobilization for war. Classrooms became controlled environments for gradual cultural reset. Teachers were instructed to avoid overt political messaging while encouraging critical thinking. Even simple practices, open questioning, group discussion, exposure to international literature, represented dramatic departures from wartime instruction methods. For children, the shift was often subtle rather than ideological. Lessons focused on rebuilding academic skills lost during the war years. Yet the atmosphere itself communicated change. Authority figures no longer demanded unquestioned loyalty. Instead, they encouraged participation. American occupation reports frequently emphasized emotional stability among youth once schooling resumed. Attendance rates rose quickly despite material shortages. Communities reported reductions in juvenile disorder and increased cooperation with local administration. The reopening of schools therefore functioned on multiple levels at once: humanitarian relief, social stabilization, and long-term political strategy. But these human and psychological dimensions formed only part of the story. Behind every reopened classroom stood complex logistical decisions and educational reforms that would determine whether the experiment could succeed. Angle 4. Educational reform and the new curriculum. American occupation authorities quickly recognized that reopening schools without changing what was taught would risk preserving the ideological foundations they aimed to dismantle. Under Nazi rule, education had fused academic learning with political conditioning. History lessons emphasized national destiny. Biology courses reinforced racial doctrine. Even mathematics problems sometimes incorporated militarized themes. The challenge facing U.S. education officers was not merely removing propaganda, but replacing it with something credible and functional. New curricula emphasized politically neutral subjects first: reading, writing, arithmetic, science, and practical knowledge necessary for Reconstruction. Civic education reappeared gradually, introducing democratic principles indirectly through discussions about responsibility, cooperation, and law rather than explicit political persuasion. Textbooks posed a major obstacle. Printing infrastructure across Germany had been heavily damaged, and paper shortages affected all sectors. Early classes often relied on hastily produced pamphlets approved by military authorities. Some lessons were dictated verbally, with students copying notes into reused notebooks assembled from salvaged pages. American advisors worked alongside German educators who had passed denazification screening. This collaboration proved essential. While U.S. officials set guidelines, local teachers understood language nuances and classroom realities. Over time, German educators themselves helped shape the emerging system, blending external oversight with local continuity. The goal was not to Americanize German education, but to remove authoritarian structures and allow a pluralistic system to re-emerge. Angle 5. Logistics, rebuilding learning in ruins. If curriculum reform addressed ideas, logistics addressed survival. Across the American occupation zone, thousands of school buildings were unusable. Bomb damage left roofs exposed to weather. Heating systems failed, making winter instruction nearly impossible without repair. In some towns, classes were held in churches, administrative offices, or even partially cleared factories. Engineering units conducted rapid safety inspections before approving buildings for use. Broken glass was replaced with temporary coverings made from wood or cardboard. Desks were repaired from salvaged materials. Communities often contributed labor voluntarily, seeing schools as shared investments in recovery. Fuel shortages created another challenge. During the winter of 1945-46, one of the coldest in decades, classrooms struggled to remain heated. Students sometimes attended lessons wearing coats and gloves. Despite discomfort, attendance remained high, a sign of how strongly communities valued the return of education. Transportation posed difficulties as well. With rail systems damaged and fuel rationed, many children walked long distances through rubble-filled streets to attend classes. American occupation vehicles occasionally transported supplies, but could not provide routine student transport. The effort depended largely on civilian resilience. Every reopened classroom, therefore, represented coordination between military administration, local labor, and scarce material resources. Reconstruction occurred incrementally, often imperfectly, yet steadily. Angle 6. The reintegration of German teachers. Perhaps the most delicate aspect of reopening schools involved deciding who would teach. Under Nazi rule, membership in party organizations had been widespread among educators. Some joined willingly, others complied to retain employment. Distinguishing ideological commitment from survival required careful investigation. The denazification process categorized individuals into levels of responsibility, determining whether they could return to professional roles. Initially, shortages of approved teachers created severe staffing gaps. Entire districts lacked enough qualified personnel. American authorities faced a dilemma. Strict exclusion risked leaving children without education, while leniency risked restoring compromised authority figures. The solution evolved gradually. Teachers cleared of serious political involvement returned first. Others underwent probationary supervision. Training programs introduced new pedagogical methods aligned with democratic values. Workshops emphasized discussion-based learning rather than rote obedience. Many educators themselves experienced profound adjustment. Teaching without ideological mandates required redefining professional identity. Some embraced the opportunity enthusiastically, viewing it as liberation from political pressure. Others struggled with uncertainty about the future direction of German society. Students, meanwhile, adapted quickly. Reports noted curiosity toward new teaching styles, especially classroom discussions encouraging personal opinions, practices uncommon in wartime education. The relationship between teachers and occupation authorities slowly shifted from oversight toward cooperation. As months passed, American administrators increasingly transferred responsibility back to German local governments, signaling growing trust. By late 1945, the combined efforts of reformers, engineers, teachers, and communities had created the conditions necessary for something once unimaginable amid the ruins. Functioning schools operating regularly across parts of occupied Germany. And as preparations turned into reality, the reopening itself would become a powerful symbolic moment, not only for Germany's recovery, but for how victory in war could transform into reconstruction and peace. The decisive moment did not arrive with ceremony or speeches. It began quietly, town by town, as orders issued from occupation headquarters translated into ordinary mornings across Western Germany. In late summer 1945, authorization notices moved through the American zone, allowing selected schools to reopen after inspection and approval. Bavaria became one of the earliest regions to resume structured education. Cities such as Munich and Nuremberg faced enormous destruction, but smaller towns offered opportunities for faster recovery. Buildings with partial damage were cleared, repaired, and declared safe enough for limited use. On reopening days, American military government officers often arrived before sunrise. They inspected classrooms one final time, checking windows, heating stoves, and seating arrangements improvised from repaired furniture. Outside, handwritten notices posted on doors listed class times and instructions for families unfamiliar with the new system. Children began arriving cautiously, many accompanied by mothers who lingered nearby rather than leaving immediately. The atmosphere carried uncertainty. Only months earlier, these same streets had echoed with marching formations and air raid alarms. Now silence returned, broken by the unfamiliar sounds of conversation and hesitant laughter. Witness accounts describe classrooms filled unevenly at first. Some families hesitated, unsure how occupation authorities would treat German students. Others feared political consequences or suspected hidden motives behind Allied educational reforms. Yet attendance increased rapidly as word spread that lessons focused on ordinary subjects, reading, mathematics, and writing, rather than political instruction. American personnel typically remained in the background. Their presence was supervisory rather than dominant. Military government education officers observed lessons quietly, ensuring compliance with new guidelines while allowing German teachers to conduct instruction independently. This balance proved essential. Schools needed legitimacy in the eyes of local communities, not the appearance of foreign control. The physical condition of many classrooms reflected the war's recent end. Walls bore cracks from nearby explosions. Windows were patched with mismatched glass panes. Chalkboards salvaged from damaged buildings stood on uneven floors. In colder regions, students sat bundled in coats as heating supplies remained unreliable. Yet despite these hardships, observers repeatedly noted a change in atmosphere. Routine returned. Bells rang again, sometimes repaired from damaged church towers or replaced by improvised signals. Lessons followed schedules rather than emergency interruptions. Children raised hands to answer questions instead of rushing toward shelters. For American occupation officials, these scenes represented measurable progress. Reports sent to headquarters emphasized not only attendance numbers, but emotional reactions. Communities demonstrated cooperation rather than resistance. Parents expressed cautious approval. Teachers adapted to revised curricula faster than many planners had anticipated. One recurring image appeared in multiple field reports: mothers watching from outside school entrances during the first days of reopening. Some waited until lessons ended, reluctant to leave children in unfamiliar circumstances after years of instability. Others spoke quietly among themselves, comparing impressions of the new system. Their reactions mattered deeply to occupation authorities. Women managing households formed the social backbone of post-war communities. Acceptance among mothers often determined whether policies gained broader legitimacy. When families trusted schools, they signaled willingness to participate in reconstruction rather than resist it. The reopening also reshaped relationships between occupiers and civilians. American soldiers passing through towns increasingly encountered children discussing homework rather than war. Informal interactions softened tensions. Small gestures, distributing surplus supplies, or assisting with repairs, reinforced impressions that occupation aimed at rebuilding rather than punishment. Still, challenges persisted. Shortages of materials limited instruction. Teacher availability remained uneven. Some communities struggled with overcrowded classrooms as displaced families returned from evacuation areas. The psychological scars of war surfaced occasionally through behavioral difficulties among students who had experienced bombings or loss. Yet the overall trajectory pointed toward stabilization. By early autumn 1945, hundreds of schools across the American zone operated regularly. Education resumed, not as a grand political announcement, but as a collection of ordinary successes repeated daily. Each reopened classroom represented proof that societal collapse could be reversed step by step. And as attendance grew and routines strengthened, a deeper transformation began to emerge, one that extended beyond education itself. Because the reopening of schools was no longer simply about children returning to lessons. It became the moment when occupation shifted visibly from victory over Germany to responsibility for its future. By the autumn of 1945, the reopening of schools had expanded beyond isolated local efforts. Across the American occupation zone, education resumed with increasing regularity, and the cumulative effect began to alter both German civilian psychology and Allied strategic expectations. What had started as administrative necessity evolved into a visible turning point in post-war Europe. The transformation revealed itself not through dramatic announcements, but through repetition. Each morning, children walked past ruins carrying books instead of evacuation bags. Streets once dominated by military traffic slowly adjusted to civilian rhythms again. Markets reopened near school buildings. Church bells and school bells began marking time together, replacing the irregular cadence of wartime alarms. American military government reports increasingly described schools as centers of normalization. Attendance statistics climbed steadily despite ongoing shortages. In many districts, enrollment exceeded pre-war expectations as displaced families returned and sought stability. Education became one of the first institutions capable of functioning reliably after governmental collapse. International observers also began to notice. Journalists accompanying Allied forces reported scenes that contrasted sharply with earlier images of destruction. Photographs showed German children seated at repaired desks, often beneath patched ceilings, studying under supervision of teachers approved by occupation authorities. These images circulated widely in Allied newspapers, shaping public perception abroad. The narrative of Germany shifted gradually, from defeated enemy to society under reconstruction. For American policymakers, this carried strategic significance extending far beyond humanitarian relief. The emerging Cold War environment was already influencing occupation priorities. Tensions between Western allies and the Soviet Union grew, increasingly visible by late 1945. Stability in Western Germany became essential not only for recovery, but for political balance in Europe. Education played a subtle but decisive role in this competition of systems. American administrators believed democratic culture could not be enforced solely through political decrees. It required daily habits learned over time, discussion, participation, and civic responsibility. Schools offered the most consistent environment in which these habits could develop. Inside classrooms, change unfolded gradually. Teachers encouraged questioning rather than memorization. Literature lessons expanded beyond nationalist themes to include broader European and world perspectives. Geography instruction reflected new political realities instead of wartime territorial claims. These adjustments appeared small individually, but collectively reshaped how younger generations understood authority and identity. German parents observed these differences carefully. Many mothers who had initially approached schools with caution began expressing approval in community meetings recorded by occupation officials. Reports described relief that lessons emphasized practical skills and stability rather than ideology. The presence of structured education reassured families that their children's futures would not be defined solely by defeat. American soldiers noticed the shift as well. Patrol reports increasingly mentioned friendly interactions with civilians near schools. Children practiced English phrases learned in class. Requests for assistance transitioned from emergency needs toward educational materials, books, pencils, maps. The tone of occupation softened without abandoning control. Yet the turning point also carried symbolic meaning for Germans themselves. For years, education had served as a tool of mobilization, preparing youth for loyalty and sacrifice. Now classrooms represented something fundamentally different: continuity beyond political collapse. Students born during the Nazi era experienced their first sustained exposure to alternative ideas within these reopened schools. Historians later identified this period as the beginning of a generational transition. Children attending classes in 1945 and 1946 would grow into adults, shaping West Germany's democratic institutions during the following decades. While occupation authorities could not predict individual outcomes, they recognized the long-term implications of restoring education quickly. The psychological atmosphere surrounding schools reflected cautious optimism. Attendance ceremonies remained modest, often limited to brief remarks by local administrators. American officials deliberately avoided grand displays, understanding that legitimacy required normalcy rather than spectacle. Success depended on schools appearing German again, even under Allied supervision. Winter approached, bringing new challenges. Fuel shortages threatened classroom heating, and food scarcity continued across much of Europe. Yet communities prioritized keeping schools open despite hardship. Parents organized volunteer efforts to collect firewood. Teachers adjusted schedules to maximize daylight hours. American supply units redirected limited resources to sustain operations through colder months. These efforts demonstrated a shared investment between occupiers and civilians, an alignment unimaginable only months earlier during active combat. The act of maintaining schools became collective proof that rebuilding had begun in earnest. By the end of 1945, the reopening of education achieved something military victory alone could not accomplish. It changed expectations. Germans increasingly looked toward recovery rather than survival, while American authorities began transitioning from emergency governance toward long-term partnership. The decisive transformation was therefore not marked by a single day or decree. It emerged through thousands of ordinary mornings when children entered classrooms and lessons continued despite the ruins outside. And as these classrooms stabilized communities across Western Germany, the consequences of this quiet turning point would soon reshape the nation's political future, revealing how Reconstruction could influence the outcome of peace as profoundly as battles had shaped the war. By early 1946, the consequences of reopening schools in the American occupation zone became increasingly apparent. Attendance rates, which had initially risen slowly due to uncertainty and logistical difficulties, stabilized at levels comparable to pre-war periods. Children who had spent years without formal instruction returned to classrooms, bringing with them not only gaps in knowledge, but also resilience shaped by survival. Military government reports from Bavaria, Hesse, and Württemberg emphasized both numbers and social effects. In smaller towns, more than 80% of school-aged children attended daily lessons, despite cold classrooms and shortages of materials. In urban centers like Nuremberg, makeshift classrooms accommodated hundreds of students, demonstrating the population's willingness to participate in organized education even amid ruins. Teachers played a critical role in translating policy into reality. Those cleared through denazification programs implemented new curricula emphasizing practical skills and civic responsibility. In some cases, veteran educators volunteered to mentor younger colleagues, while American advisors provided guidance on administrative procedures and lesson planning. This partnership enabled classrooms to function efficiently despite resource limitations. The social impact extended beyond the walls of schools. Mothers, who had observed the first days with cautious hope, became active participants in sustaining operations. Community-organized efforts included gathering firewood for heating, repairing broken desks, and assisting with supervision during the school day. These activities reinforced a sense of agency for women who had borne the brunt of wartime responsibilities. Children, in turn, responded to the renewed structure. Letters and diaries preserved from the period reveal increased morale, engagement, and a tentative sense of normalcy. Recreational activities integrated into lessons provided opportunities for socialization and stress relief, which psychologists later recognized as essential for trauma recovery. Even brief exposure to consistent daily schedules had measurable effects on emotional stability. The reopening of schools also contributed to broader civic stability. Reports noted reductions in juvenile disorder and petty crime in areas where education resumed consistently. In towns previously marked by looting or civil unrest, the presence of structured daily routines created predictability and reduced tensions between civilians and occupying forces. American observers quickly recognized that schools had become a soft power instrument. Beyond restoring literacy and numeracy, education served as a bridge between former enemies. Interactions between German teachers, students, and American officials fostered mutual understanding. Children learned English, American history, and democratic principles, while soldiers and administrators gained firsthand experience with the civilian population's resilience and needs. Humanitarian outcomes were significant as well. School facilities often doubled as distribution centers for food, clothing, and medical care. Mothers who accompanied children to school benefited indirectly, accessing resources that might otherwise have been difficult to obtain. In this way, education became part of a broader social safety network, stabilizing communities while facilitating occupation goals. Despite successes, challenges remained. Material shortages persisted. Some classrooms still lacked desks or adequate heating. Certain districts faced staffing shortages as denazification reviews delayed teacher availability. Nonetheless, the cumulative effect of reopening schools exceeded expectations, demonstrating that even in a devastated country, coordinated civilian and military effort could produce rapid, tangible improvements. By late spring 1946, the American Zone had established a framework capable of supporting sustained education across the region. Enrollment figures, attendance consistency, and community involvement all indicated that classrooms were functioning as intended. The policy achieved multiple objectives simultaneously: restoring normal life, reducing social unrest, providing practical skills, and introducing democratic habits for a new generation. These early successes provided the foundation for long-term transformation. Schools became symbols of recovery, visible markers of order in towns that only months before had known destruction. Mothers, having observed the reopening firsthand, began to trust the occupation authorities' broader policies. Children absorbed skills and values that would shape post-war Germany. Communities demonstrated resilience that would carry them through subsequent hardships. And as society stabilized around education, the broader implications for Germany's future, political, social, and economic, began to crystallize, preparing the way for the next phase of reconstruction. The long-term consequences of reopening schools in the American occupation zone extended far beyond immediate relief. By restoring education, the Allies laid the groundwork for a generation that would help shape West Germany's post-war identity, politics, and economy. One of the most significant effects was the gradual normalization of civic life. Children who had spent formative years under totalitarian instruction now experienced structured environments emphasizing critical thinking, personal responsibility, and cooperative learning. These lessons, repeated daily across hundreds of classrooms, introduced habits of citizenship compatible with democratic institutions. Over time, these young students would form the backbone of West Germany's emerging political culture, reinforcing norms of participation, debate, and public accountability. Education also fostered economic recovery. Literacy and numeracy skills, once disrupted by years of war and displacement, returned to measurable levels. Vocational instruction, integrated into early curricula, prepared students for trades necessary in rebuilding cities, roads, and infrastructure. By the early 1950s, evidence showed that regions where schools had reopened efficiently experienced faster reintegration into industrial and agricultural productivity. Social cohesion improved as well. Mothers and families, initially wary of Allied policies, became active participants in educational initiatives. Women organized community efforts, repaired classrooms, and provided logistical support. These contributions strengthened local bonds and reinforced trust between civilians and occupation authorities. The classrooms functioned as microcosms of cooperative rebuilding, demonstrating that recovery required both civilian initiative and organized guidance. Politically, the reopening of schools contributed to the success of denazification and democratization programs. With children removed from the direct influence of extremist ideology, opportunities for indoctrination diminished. Curricula emphasizing pluralism, civic responsibility, and tolerance introduced concepts that would permeate broader society as students matured. In effect, the classroom became a controlled environment for cultural transformation, allowing the next generation to develop values distinct from those imposed during the Third Reich. Internationally, the strategy proved influential in shaping perceptions of Allied occupation. Reports circulated in American and British media highlighted the humanitarian dimension of Reconstruction. Photographs of children returning to repaired classrooms contrasted sharply with images of destroyed cities, framing the occupation not as punitive but as constructive. This narrative reinforced public support for sustained engagement in Europe, even as tensions with the Soviet Union began to crystallize in the early Cold War period. Challenges persisted, of course. Many classrooms remained under-resourced. Teachers faced psychological strain and uncertainty about the political future. Rural regions struggled with uneven staffing and infrastructure gaps. Nonetheless, the strategic objectives of the occupation were largely achieved. Schools became functional, respected institutions that simultaneously advanced recovery, instilled democratic principles, and stabilized communities. By the mid-1940s, the American approach to educational reconstruction had influenced broader policy decisions. Military government lessons informed initiatives in other Allied zones, while studies conducted by OMGUS evaluated successes and shortcomings in teacher vetting, curriculum design, and community engagement. These evaluations informed long-term planning for the eventual transition from military occupation to civilian governance. Perhaps most importantly, the reopened schools symbolized hope in a country marked by loss. Mothers and families witnessed tangible proof that life could resume amid ruins. Children regained the routines, knowledge, and social interaction that had been denied them during the war years. Communities rediscovered cohesion through shared commitment to education, setting a foundation for sustained recovery in both practical and psychological terms. Ultimately, the decision to prioritize schooling demonstrated that reconstruction is as much a social and cultural process as it is physical. By investing in children and families, American occupation authorities ensured that Germany's post-war trajectory would be defined less by vengeance and more by rebuilding, resilience, and the gradual establishment of democratic norms. The effects of this policy persisted for decades, shaping not only the lives of those who returned to classrooms in 1945 and 1946, but the broader identity of West Germany as a stable, prosperous, and democratic society. And with communities now functioning under the rhythm of school bells, the stage was set for a reflective understanding of what education could achieve, both as a symbol and as a tool for shaping the future. In the quiet mornings of post-war Germany, the simple act of opening a school became a profound symbol of renewal. Where once classrooms had echoed with ideology and fear, they now filled with the tentative sounds of reading, writing, and laughter. Mothers watched their children step across thresholds with cautious hope, embodying the enduring human desire for stability and continuity. The war had stripped away certainty, yet within the walls of these repaired schools, a new certainty began to emerge: the possibility of rebuilding not only structures, but lives. Education proved to be more than a practical necessity. It was a bridge between the trauma of the past and the promise of a future shaped by choice rather than coercion. In classrooms filled with patched desks and salvaged books, the lessons extended beyond arithmetic and grammar. They taught resilience, patience, and the potential for societies to recover from profound destruction. Children learned that knowledge could restore agency, that the mundane rhythm of lessons could anchor communities, and that human connections, teacher to student, parent to child, civilian to occupier, could survive even the darkest chapters of history. From a strategic perspective, the reopening of schools demonstrated a subtle yet decisive form of power. Victory on the battlefield was one measure. Shaping the minds of the next generation was another. By investing in education, the Americans transformed occupation from imposition into partnership, creating conditions for long-term stability, democratic culture, and social cohesion. The quiet work of Reconstruction revealed that influence can often be most effective not through force, but through opportunity and guidance. For the mothers, children, and communities who witnessed these first reopened schools, the experience carried an enduring lesson. Even amid ruins, human determination and structured care could restore hope. It was a reminder that peace is not merely the absence of conflict, but the presence of growth, learning, and the assurance that the future can be different from the past. In this way, the reopening of German schools after World War II stands as a testament to the power of education, a humanizing force capable of transforming defeat into resilience, rubble into classrooms, and uncertainty into possibility. It was one of the quietest yet most enduring victories of Reconstruction, echoing far beyond the shattered streets and ruined buildings of 1945 Germany. Through the simple, deliberate act of opening doors and filling classrooms, Americans and Germans together demonstrated that Reconstruction was more than bricks and mortar. It was the rebuilding of society's moral and civic foundations, the reclamation of childhood from the shadow of totalitarianism, and the reaffirmation that hope can take root even in the aftermath of devastation. And so, as mothers watched their children write at chalkboards for the first time in years, the nation began to imagine a future not dictated by war, but by learning, care, and collective resilience, a future shaped as much by the quiet determination of ordinary people as by the might of armies.